Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this joint European Political Center Egmont webinar dedicated to what could be seen as the new frontier for the future of the EU, the global world, let alone mankind, i.e. artificial intelligence. We have the privilege of gathering a fairly high-level panel this morning, and I very warmly thank our guest speakers for having spared some time out of their utterly busy schedules to join us today. As usual, a few household tips you are all getting familiar with after this year-long lockdown. You have the possibility to ask questions either orally, raising the hand, or in writing, using the chat box. In both cases, we'll ask you to be as short and as to the point as possible. Of course, we are going to record this public event so that it will be made available on EPC and Egmont's channel later on. Don't also wait for the end of the first part of the conversation to start asking your questions so that we could follow up immediately with the question and answer. We are foreseeing approximately 60 minutes for this webinar this morning. On substance, let me start this conversation with some quotes. In a speech delivered at the occasion of the Masters of Digital 2021, President of the European Council, Charles Michel, stated that the world is on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution. Europe has enormous potential in the fields of data, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. Our industrial data, for instance, represents a massive resources, and the move towards edge computing will put Europe in a much more favorable position than in previous stage when non-European actors took the lead in personal data gathering and cloud computing. Another quote, and I promise that I will stop with this one. In its 2018 communication on artificial intelligence, the Commission stressed that AI is helping us to solve some of the world's biggest challenges, and that the EU could lead the way in developing and using AI for good and for all. However, championing such an approach that benefits people and society as a whole would be possible if and only if Europe was competitive in the AI landscape, no one was left behind in the digital transformation, and new technologies were based on value. Bearing this in mind, let me turn now to our panelists. Dragos Tudorache, you are the chair of the, I quote, Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age of the European Parliament, but I'd really prefer to use the acronym IDA. It sounds much more musical in this case. It was established in June 2020. It has a broad mandate, although with strictly defined responsibility. The committee you chair is now halfway through its term of office. Therefore, obviously, my first question to you would be, what are, according to your assessment, the key issues which the committee should focus on in view of defining common EU objectives in the medium and the long term as required by its mandate? Dragos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Interesting debate, interesting webinar you've organized. And of course, AI has become a bit over the last 2 years the buzzword, or one of the buzzwords in Brussels, COVID-19 aside. And it's true that also the establishment of AIDA has been seen a bit as a manifestation of this very high level of political attention that has been given to frontier technologies in general and artificial intelligence in particular. So speaking of the AIDA mandate, it has, as you rightly said, indeed been drafted as a very broad mandate, but with very specific elements in it. The part that I like the most, if I am to be personal in this presentation, is the fact that it gives us the possibility to look into the future. And I think that this is indeed one of the key, or at least I'm trying to imprint this approach into the work of AIDA, to really see what we do as throwing a bit the ball 10 years from now, and looking at the impacts that artificial intelligence will have on all walks of life, into our societies, into our economies, into our strategic outlook as nations and as a continent, as a union, into the future. And why is that? Well, the first reason is very institutional. We already have specialized standing committees that are going to look into the nitty-gritty, detailed analysis of the various proposals that will come from the Commission, and they will also be looking and drafting various policy documents specific to their work. Whereas what AIDA was supposed to do is to cut across a bit. To cut across the specific work of all the other committees and to really bring the different threads together into a composite view of what artificial intelligence means, again, for our societies, for our democracies, for our economies. So again, for me, this outlook into the future is the key part of our mandate. And in the work that we've done so far, in the way we've selected the themes on which AIDA has worked, we looked into health, we looked into the Green Deal, we're looking into the big issues that are also part of the priorities of this political cycle. And again, always trying to look ahead and see what it means and what AI can mean for these particular issues. What lies ahead is a report. AIDA will have to finish its work with a report that should be bringing in these collective views on AI and its impacts on the various domains and sectors of, again, societies, states, economies, so on and so forth. And also, very importantly, AIDA will hopefully also finish its mandate with a good record of reaching outside of the EU. This is the second point I want to make in this first part about AIDA and its work, which is that we also take our mandate as a platform to reach out to like-minded partners. We are in the process of establishing a more structured dialogue with the AI caucus in the US Congress. We believe that we need to build on the transatlantic relationship. Next week, we're going to have a joint hearing with AFET, AIDA and AFET, that is going to very specifically look into the transatlantic relationship and what it means and how AI can contribute to that. So again, for us in AIDA, this work outside of the EU borders is something that is very important, because while we are going to develop our EU standards and our EU legislation on artificial intelligence, like we do on data and digital markets and digital services and whatnot, at the same time, we have to be doing it and think of the standards that we want to develop in a broader context. We need to reach out to see whether these standards can be acceptable or built in an acceptable fashion, again, with partners at the global stage, if we want to have the global impact that both President Charles Michel was talking about, as well as the communication of the Commission that we mentioned from 2018. If we want to be global partners, if we want to be serious about this, then we have to understand our role in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Still struggling with my audio. Mr. Jørgensen, you are the Chief of Staff of Vice President Vestager. The final report of the public consultation on the white paper of artificial intelligence was published in November 2020. In its work program for 2021, the Commission refers to the presentation of the Data Act during the third quarter, and also the presentation of a legislation covering the safety, liability, fundamental rights, and data aspects of artificial intelligence, without giving any precise indication about the deadline for the presentation of this initiative. In other words, could you tell us more about what we can expect, and could you tell us more about the main lessons that the Commission is drawing from the public consultation based on the white paper? Mr. Jørgensen, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jean-Luc. I will start with the second issue first. But as you said in the very beginning, and also was Dragos was saying, the potential of AI is huge for the well-being of our society. I think it's very important that we talk about both the opportunities and of course also the risk, because AI is implying both opportunities and risk. And I think it's also very important to stress from the beginning that there's a lot of talk about EU sort of lagging behind the US and the Chinese on this, which is not the case. I think we have a lot of leading experts in AI. I think we produce 25% of all industrial robots, and every second of our manufacturers are using AI. So we are actually doing well, but we have to do even better. And I think all of us recognize both the opportunities and the risk, and that was basically the reasons why we had the report from 2018. That was the reasons why we had also the white paper on AI in February last year, and that's why the Commission is now planning for legislation, 2 sets of legislation for this year. I'll come back to that. The white paper in February, I think, was quite a success. We had more than 1,200 direct contributions from all over the world. But even more important, it has triggered a very intense and risk debate about the opportunities and risk inherent in AI. The number of research and policy papers published during the last year has been impressive, and so the number of conferences and workshops like this one, and not only at EU level, actually globally, that Dragos was mentioning as well. The white paper has also been a success in that it showed a considerable extent of alignment among stakeholders. There is a wide agreement that our double approach of fostering both excellence and trust in AI is the right way to go. Excellence is needed because AI is a key technology, as I mentioned, in which Europe needs to be strong, because it is important for our global competitiveness and because it can help us to achieve many societal needs. Just take climate change as one example. Or only the intelligent use of data would allow us to achieve the efficiency gains needed to achieve our ambitious targets. But the white paper consultations also confirmed that we need to secure trust in this technology. This is crucial for the social acceptance of AI and for its wider take-up. People need to be sure that a product that embeds AI will not cause them harm, and if it still does, that the resulting harm can be addressed on the basis of a clear liability rules. People also need to be assured that their fundamental rights are respected when an AI is involved in taking decisions that affects their lives, their privacy, for example, or their chances of getting a job or a loan. But there is a wide consensus that our legislation needs to be proportionately and innovation-friendly, that we should focus on high-risk solutions only. That's why we have this pyramid, that it's only at the very top of the pyramid that you basically ban things, and then you have people that we call high risk, and that is exactly what our horizontal AI legislation, which we will propose later this spring in April, will do. And then, Jean-Luc, you mentioned the work on liability, and the reasons why we have not mentioned any date in the work program is basically that it's very much work in progress. Here we definitely need more time. Services has just started their impact assessments work on this, and we expect the proposal only to be made at the end of this year at the earliest. It's simply more complicated, and we need a bit more time on that. And then one final remark: people often argue that legislation and innovation are a contradiction, but this is not the case here. With our AI legislation, we will create for the first. I mean, this is the first piece globally, and therefore it's also looked at from all over the world. We are creating a harmonized set of rules for the whole Europe. This is what our businesses need, and we will create the legal certainty about what is allowed and what is not. So I'm looking very much forward to participate in our discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bonefeld-Dahl, I mean, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. A full implementation of the EU digital agenda, and you are, CEO of Digital Europe, will necessitate massive investments. I mean, the figures quoted in the 2018 communication of the Commission are huge. Do you think that joining forces, EU public and private sectors, will be able to meet these requirements with regard to the investment needed to achieve this very ambitious agenda? Over to you.
Well, I can definitely tell you what I hope. I do hope, and I think a collaboration between private and public sector is kind of the European way of doing this, right? And we do need extensive investment, and we also need to secure the path on how we do that, and the areas that we would like to start and lead with. I think we have started very well with the health data space, and just reminding that AI without data is not worth much. And I think we have some quite, how do you say, crucial projects going on right now with the Gaia-X, with the health data space. One of the issues that we see is that it's easy for big companies to, or easy, it's not easy, but it's more easy for big companies to actually obtain large amounts of data. In Europe, it's especially complicated because we have national governments and then we have different procedures. And I think our goal should be to have equal access to data and innovations for also SMEs. And that will be the first step on that road to basically having also a huge uptake of AI across border and across sectors in Europe, because 99% of our economy is based on SMEs. And if we don't get that, we don't get it right. Second of all, I think the next step is, of course, also to be aware of for national policymakers and we see the Commission, both the Commission and the Council taking the lead and really trying to get the national leaders to understand that if we have a fragmentation of interpretations of framework, that being in GDPR, that being in AI, that being in any digital area, but also in the way that we handle it, you know, too many institutions, too many layers of control and management and administration, then we will not reach that target, and we will not become the leaders in areas where we can. So I do agree with Tim. He said that innovation and regulation are not necessarily two contradicting themes. It is more the way you do it. The way are we able to basically get everyone on board to do it in a way that is business friendly, that also benefits, you know, smaller companies, that allows companies to harvest data, to get approvals really fast and smooth, then I think we will lead. I think our way of doing things is right now the biggest challenge. We have the talent, we have the innovative companies, but we do see them jumping outside Europe because Europe is too cumbersome. So making a business-friendly environment of administration and investment for also scale-ups and of course for as an open market, also able to compete in an open market, that will be the hard part. And of course the AI regulation cannot do that alone, but I think we are taking and seeing the first step. And the big question is, can we not repeat what we did on GDPR, where GDPR was like, everybody said, the GDPR what, you know, and then, yeah, but we've been discussing this in Brussels for 7 years. Yeah, but I mean, people are busy, you know, they don't really pay attention. They're busy earning money, right? So how can we basically test this regulation on real life examples and real companies and see what does it actually do for them? You know, how can we, to a maximum extent, eliminate or avoid, of course there will be some mess, I mean it's how it is, right, when you change things, but how can we avoid a further setback, especially for the companies with little resources? So that was a long talk. I think we can if we get it right, and the way that we implement this and the way that we design this. And I think we see some good tones of really discussing what is real risk and what is not a risk, you know, what is perceived and what do we already have. We have our fundamental rights. You know, you cannot discriminate in Europe, that's illegal. You cannot violate people's privacy, that's also illegal. So we have some really good foundational principles that we should apply. And I also think, actually, we were discussing the other day in Digital Europe, what are this digital compass that the Commission is now coming out on a hearing with until I think the 9th of March. what are the principles that could kind of be the principles behind the charter? And very shortly, you will come out and see that I think we learned something also from the AI process here. So even there, I think we have a shortcut on how to basically also get all the countries, because it's not really about the companies. They will comply. It's about how we enable growth and how we get the national governments on board.
Thank you very much. It was not at all a long talk, and you touch very different issues. And I would like to further elaborate on the external dimension of the issue together with Andreas. AI uptake in Europe, Andreas, and I as well in emerging technologies more in general, are closely linked to the broader debate on strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy, and digital sovereignty. What is, according to you, the current global context of political developments with regard to AI, and how should the EU pursue its digital sovereignty abroad while fostering growth and innovation at home? It's about the geopolitics of AI. Please, Andreas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. And this is the million-dollar question, I guess. So I will try to be brief, but also substantive. Well, when we look at the global context, the principles on which we should build AI are largely agreed between, the principles that the EU has in mind are largely agreed at the OECD and G20 multilateral forums. So setting foundations for responsible AI is key, and now to this, the EU is leading in this respect. But Europe does not have the monopoly of value setting. So in this sense, to give you an example, we have heard people saying, for example, AI development should promote fairness and justice, protect the rights and interests of stakeholders, promote equality of opportunity. It should promote green development and meet the requirements of environmental friendliness and resource conservation. All these principles I'm reading to you now are from the principles of AI government and responsible AI, which is an ethics statement produced by China's National Committee of AI Experts last June in 2019. So basically, what I wanted to say by showing this example is that others are trying to set the example with the right values to build AI. But now, as global players are talking about, other global players are talking about values too, the important task for the EU is to translate those principles into actual global regulations. And until now, the ongoing geopolitical rivalry between the US and China had hampered the development of these non-binding recommendations into actual regulations. And more generally, the global discussion on internet regulation. So basically, for the EU to foster growth in this sector of AI through good regulation could be in the future dwarfed by the gargantuan investments of the US and China in this field. So along with good regulation, the EU should also foster greater investment, as Ms. Bonefeld-Dahl was saying earlier, and other speakers. So in terms of investment, the US still stands out as the economy that invests the most in research and development for this kind of technology, and it's followed by China and the EU. Now, the rapid rise of China between 2000 and 2016 has lowered the relative weights of the EU and the US in global expenditure. So, for example, the US share fell from 38% to 26% in 2016. And similarly, the EU represented 22% of global R&D expenditure in 2000, but only 18% in 2016. Now, in the same time frame, China's share increased from 5% to 23%. So, obviously, this is a lot about values and setting the right foundations, because people have to trust this technology in order to see its commercial uptake and its adaptation, and also to see SMEs to grow and innovate on this field. But sooner or later, the EU will have to set out the right framework conditions for data infrastructure and other key developments, as have been mentioned already, to be enforced in order for growth and innovation to take on in the market to start producing results that basically are in line with the strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty that you mentioned.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely come back on that later during this morning conversation. By the way, I will now start with the second round of questions to our panelists, but I would really encourage those participating into this webinar, and you are numerous, to start asking questions. Dragos, I would like to come back to what is being discussed now within the Parliament. You further elaborated and you provide us with first-hand information about the mandate of your committee. But now I would like with you to dig a little bit more about the substance of the debate and the discussion within the European Parliament. Could you enlighten us about what the main debating lines are in the European Parliament when it comes to the Commission white paper and the outcome of the public consultation? Where do you see possible alignment between the two institutions, but where do you see also possible divergences between the two institutions? Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I think by now, as Kim was also saying, and with AI being so much of a hot topic in town, I think by now there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of webinars and online conferences and events on AI. So it's rather easy to get a sense of what are the feelings in the various communities of stakeholders. How does the business feel about AI and what the EU is preparing to do? How does the society actors at large, the think tanks, civil society, governments who also have spoken through various documents, vision documents or strategies over the last 2 years. What are the main debating points? I think talking to the business, and we've heard already a very good set of points earlier on. Some of the issues that I've picked up in the conversations is, number one, the data sets. There's a discussion about how will we be defining the rules, the conditions for data sets that will be feeding the algorithms of tomorrow. What does it mean, European data sets? Will we force companies to actually develop from scratch data sets that will be used for developing algorithms, or will they be allowed to use existing data sets and databases? In what conditions? What would be the rules for that? So that's one conversation that I've heard very much coming from some of the bigger platforms, of course, which are already sitting on piles and piles of data, personal data or otherwise, and of course they would want to use the data they have rather than develop new data sets for new algorithms, and there's a debate and a discussion about that. The second point of debate, also coming from the business sector, is how will we be translating the type of ethical norms that we will be putting in the legislation into easy technical specs, let's say. So, or how will we make sure that the legislation that we write and the criteria that we will be putting in there, for example, for defining risks, will be something that the companies, big or small, startups or scale-ups or big giants, how will they be, again, making sure that they can understand that and put that into easily understandable things for the engineers that will be developing algorithms. Another one is, of course, the big million-dollar issue is the definition of risks. So how will the Commission end up? Of course, we don't know yet exactly how the Commission will do that, but again, everyone is very keen to know how will the definition of risks look like? What will the various gradients of risk and how the Commission will be defining those gradients? Another one is, how should I put it? It's a fear, and I think it was raised also before, the fear of missing out on innovation, or missing out the opportunity for growth in Europe. Again, that's something that I feel very much intrinsic in the way the business is looking at us. They understand the need for regulation, I think, by now. They are all at peace with the fact that regulation will come, but they still fear because of sometimes the way we used to do things in the EU, that again, it will come out too complicated. It will come out as a fundamental block for innovation and for being able to work across the union rather than in fragmented bits and pieces of markets, as sometimes it happens right now, particularly in the digital sector. And I feel that this is one of the biggest concerns they have. If we move on to the societal actors, I think clearly the debating lines are around biases, around discrimination, also around the potential for AI to be fundamentally contributing to the spread of further fake news and disinformation, knowing that they are very powerful machines that can actually accelerate that. And of course, a big fear, which no matter what we say, we cannot stop, a big fear of a good part of our society losing out, missing out on the opportunity of AI, and that also translates into the fear of losing jobs. So again, for a good part of the society actors, this is something that concerns them, and they need reassurances that in the way we're going to develop and exploit the opportunities of frontier tech in general and AI in particular, we do it in as much of an indiscriminate fashion as possible, in as much of an inclusive fashion as possible. If we have to move to politicians, that is getting even more complicated. Of course, their ideologies kick in, and we have the usual discussions about opportunities. How do we make sure that the businesses in Europe are growing, going all the way to, of course, ensuring that the green footprint and the objectives that we have on the Green Deal remain unaffected, or maybe even more facilitated by AI rather than à l'inverse. And a growing concern and a growing debate on the impact of AI on democracy and on states, which I also feel personally that this is a debate that we haven't had enough in Europe, and I think, and also globally. And I think it's a debate that we should actually be doing more, because if we look around only on the impact of social media, but it's not only about social media, I think the fundamentals of state democracies are being impacted by frontier tech, and we need to have a conversation. And very quickly on the let's say the convergence points, I think where I feel there is an overall convergence across stakeholders and also across political groups in parliament is, first of all, on the momentum for regulation. I think we are all there again with concerns still left, right, about nuances. But I think by now everyone understands that it is time to regulate. It is time to put order into how AI is going to grow and develop in the future. The second point of convergence is indeed the need for an ethical framework. I think everyone understands, businesses, societal actors, politicians, everyone in the street, they all understand that we need this framework of principles that are very much going into what makes us Europeans, which is the values that we believe in, the rights, how the individual citizens is regarded in our societies in Europe, and I think again there is consensus about that. The third point of consensus that I feel has been emerging is the need for differentiation in the way we regulate, and I really want to underscore this. It is fundamental that in the way we'll regulate, we will be able to differentiate between sectors, differentiate between the various applications and the outcomes of AI, because one-size-fits-all solutions here do not work, will not work, will only be representing a problem, particularly for the economical development and for growth and innovation, therefore differentiation, and why not also a staged approach in regulating. We can regulate now what we understand, what we can grasp in terms of implications, and we can also let a bit of the new wave of regulation playing out, seeing how it impacts society and economies, and then come up with a second wave of regulation if that will be needed. And last point, I also alluded to that in the beginning, which is again this need for reaching out, for doing this in the global framework where it deserves to be dealt with. So this point of AI diplomacy is something where I feel there is now convergence. Everyone talks about the need to do that on a multilateral level, again reaching out to like-minded partners, but also be mindful of those other global actors out there, which may not be sharing the same way of looking at values as we do, but which are nevertheless elephants in the room that you cannot avoid, and therefore you need to be dealing with those and be prepared to deal with those as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive inventory of issues. Mr. Jørgensen, please, first of all, feel free to comment on what you've heard from the other panelists. But I would like in particular to ask you a question following Andreas' intervention. Okay, everybody since 1 year and a half, 2 years is mouthful about the so-called Brussels effect. I mean, it would suffice for the EU to adopt standards, a framework, regulation, and just because of the size of the EU market, very soon these standards, this regulatory framework, these benchmarks would become global benchmarks. And of course, the RGPD is a case in point with regard to the so-called Brussels effect. The question that was really very well sketched by Andreas is, are we not too late, taking into account the balance between the geopolitical actor around the AI, are we not too late to benefit from this Brussels effect? That is to say, should indeed the EU adopt a regulatory framework based on ethical standards for the AI in a not so distant future? Isn't it too late? That's to say, will that not already been done? Or, I mean, will the global standards not have been set in the meanwhile by other players? This is one question, but please feel free also to tackle other issues like the one that were listed by Dragos Tudorache in this previous intervention. Over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, and already a very rich discussion on the Brussels effect. As I said in the very beginning, there are many people out there who think that we are lagging behind, both in terms of the number of AI professors, the number of patents, and which I simply don't think. I mean, the legislation that the Commission will adopt in April will be the first ever globally, and the number of people from all around the globe who are taking a keen interest in this is actually quite vast. And I expect that this is going to be one of the key subjects for discussions with the new Biden administration. We are already beginning to reach out, and then I think Dragos was also mentioning this, but not only the Americans. I mean, Japan, Korea, Canada, whatever. I think there is a keen interest in EU, and I think the GDPR example, of course, will also have an impact here. It's correct that many people are looking at how to deal with things, and we have seen individual states in the US already dealing with this as well. But I think it's the right moment. I mean, sometimes things need to be ripe. And as Dragos said, now there's a general consensus that we need to do something here, and I think the right moment is there. And of course, this legislation, we also need to do it right. That's why we have had the public consultation. That's why we're still working very much on the proposal, because again, we're taking sort of this pyramid where you have at the very top the very few areas where it's banned by right away, and then you will have high risk areas which are then the next layer, but the vast part of the pyramid will actually be with low or zero risk. And I think that's also very important for business to know that. So it is complicated. I think there will be a Brussels effect. It might be that other partners will not do it exactly the same way as we are doing it, but I'm quite sure that we will influence it. And I think we have even had the EVP Vestager had a very good digital dialogue with the Deputy Prime Minister Liu He from China in this autumn. I mean, it was very clear where we disagreed. It was a frank and constructive meeting, but also areas where on standardization, there's also areas where you can work together. So I think this is going to be a key element. It's going to be a very important element at the EU-India summit in Porto, beginning of May. I think it's the 8th of May. I think here we work on a separate thing on AI. So this is going to be also in the EU dialogue, sort of more generally with Africa, Western Balkans. We had a meeting with the Ukraine Prime Minister 2 weeks ago where this was also part of the agenda. So I think there's a good chance for having a Brussels effect on this. Of course, this legislation is also, as I said, very much work in progress. But one of the questions I saw in the chat, where we will also need to be aware that it's difficult to put the same burden on the small and the startups, a little bit like we did with the DSA, the Digital Service Act, back in December. I think you need to differentiate between sort of very big players who have bigger possibilities and the smaller players. But then at the same time, if it's a very sensitive area where you use an algorithm to diagnose cancer, that even a small company will need to apply with rules. One of the biggest challenges, like Cecilia mentioned in her intervention, is the fragmentation of legislation. And I think that's basically the driver, because behind digitalization being one of the twin transitions for this Commission's mandate is that we are seeing now in member states on the DSA, Digital Market Act, Digital Service Act, and now here in AI, there's a risk that individual member states are introducing own legislation that sort of basically undermine the internal market. So I think this is a very important part of it. Another very important part of it is money. As we said, we need money. Of course, there's quite a lot of money in the RFF. We hope that we can have the RFF ratified, the regulation ratified, so that the first money national plans can be paid out by June, July. I think there's around, there's quite a lot of money in there, 140 billion for digitalization. In the Horizon Europe, we have 80 billion for digitalization. So there are quite a lot of money out there, where some of them should definitely be used for AI. But the problem up to now at EU level has been a scaling up problem. Whenever we have identified small startups who had some kind of success, they were either bought up by American or Chinese company, or they moved to the US themselves, like Spotify did originally. That, I think, is the biggest challenge for us, is to keep them here and to make scale up possible at EU level. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bonefeld, I really would like to follow up with you on what Mr. Jørgensen just said. You yourself hinted at the necessity to, protect SMEs, and I think that you can find a lot about that, a lot about SMEs concerns in the Commission papers, the digital hubs, for instance, and the role that they could play in the future. Is that enough according to your assessment? My second question would be about exactly what Mr. Jørgensen said. We haven't mentioned yet the C word during this conversation, the COVID word. Is the pandemic, according to your assessment and the assessment of your organization and the response which is proposed by the pandemic, to the pandemic by the EU, is it challenging, the digital agenda objectives, or is it offering new opportunities? Because, for instance, when you refer to the next generation EU, okay, I would say that very soon, hopefully, the EU institution will have completed their homework, but then the ball will be in the court of the member states. The way they will draft their national recovery and resilience plan, and the way they will indeed, comply with the digital agenda targets and the overall objectives in artificial intelligence. Here again, the Commission has insisted already back in 2018 on the necessity for a close association of the member states to everything which is being done at EU level with regard to the digital agenda. How do you see that working? Is it actually responding to the Commission expectation, or could the coalition between the institutions and the member states be more effective and productive? Over to you.
Well,
sorry, yeah.
It's my mistake, classical mistake. I rest my case. Listen, no, I wanted to say that the Commission and also the Council, I think we've seen a collaboration with the Council and the Commission that we haven't really seen before. I think politically, there has been a great leadership. Now, of course, the proof is in the pudding, like they say, right? It's now we need to see if it's possible to take a leadership where we bring along all the EU member states. And it's not an easy task. So there is both a leadership, and I will return to that internationally, and within EU. And I think the leadership has been clearly taken. And now, of course, you can offer the horse water, but you cannot force it to drink, right? This will be the biggest challenge, to make sure that we don't get further fragmentation in both regulatory measures, but also in investment. And we know now that all the plans, right now we have 16 plans, I believe, that have been handed into the Commission for review. It seems that they all hit their target, but the quality is very different. And second of all, one thing that I personally think is really sad to see is that many governments do not even think about working with the other governments, right? So it's normally like, if you want something to grow, you need to think 1 + 1 is 3. And luckily, we have seen now the V4 countries actually signing a declaration, and I hope that they will live up to their words, that they want to collaborate in this digital investments. We need to see much more of that, because the fact is that all countries in Europe are small. Some of them don't know, but they still are very small on this, right? And if we are to lead, they need to recognize that without collaboration and scale, we will not lead. And it's one of those crucial times where, you know, it's just, can we just continue? And, you know, can we just do it? No, we can't. And this is, like Kim says, the biggest challenge. Why is it that we cannot have things scaling up in our internal market? Or have we just made it easier for the ones who are already big to make business in Europe, right? It is because we are still very fragmented in our way of thinking as Europe is one team. And that needs to change, not only for the AI investment, not only for the AI regulation, but in general for Europe to succeed as a economic superpower and a place where businesses think, it's attractive. So let me elaborate a little bit on real problems and perceived problems. Do we have a lot of severe violations of security and risk due to AI that we have not addressed? For example, okay, we have had scandals, but they're all addressed. Do we have severe things happening right now as we speak due to AI that we cannot address with either current regulation or interpretation of current regulations? If we do, that is where we need to look at regulatory, further building on top. And this is exactly what the Commission said. We need to look at the high risk areas. And I think if I look at real problems, do we have a lack of and a risk of leaving a lot of people behind in the job market? Yes. Do we have troubles for scale-ups to access good amount of data? And I'm not talking about, only say, some companies have big amounts of data, but we have public data, health data, really good quality data in Europe, which is difficult to access. Yes, we do. Do we have a big request for safe data spaces? Yes, we do. Do we have difficulties for access of scalability for smaller companies? Yes, we do. And is it very hard to get approvals for companies like Cortis that was mentioned in the president's speech? Yes, their products are on the US market already because they have a fast track process for health products, which is very high quality, but they know that, these kind of technology products that can save lives needs first class attention to get to market. Many of them are not in market in Europe yet. So there are perceived problems and there are real problems. And we need to address with the right measures for the right things first. So if you ask me, are we behind? There's a lot of things where we are not behind. But we are behind on scalability. We are behind on skills. We are behind and too slow on our approvals for, our innovations. So we are losing ground each day. And these problems we need to solve first, in parallel with, of course, keeping a close eye on what do we need. I mean, when we worked in the AI group, we actually learned a lot. It was a very diverse group. I'm telling you, we had some very long nights and weekends of discussions for 2 years. First of all, we start with ethical AI, and we skipped the term ethical. Everybody has an opinion on ethical. We decided to call it trustworthy AI for a reason, because when we looked at the 7 factors, I'm happy to share in the chat in a second, when we looked at privacy, robustness, we discovered that we had regulations. We were protected on all these liabilities. We were protected to a high degree on these. Okay, there might be things and bits and pieces that need to be strengthened, but we were very well ready actually on regulation in Europe. Then on the high risk areas, okay, transparency, accountability, and were the 2 that we kept on circling: high risk, accountability, transparency. And then you need to define high risk. But I just want to say, real European companies and people are you know, they don't want to be left behind. They want the right skills and they want their products to be able to scale in Europe. These are not perceived problems. These are real problems. And this is why, you know, I think the leadership has been taken. We see the funding, 20% towards digital, really fantastic. Now the Commission also needs to work with the Council to say, what are the things where, you know, we can say we only allow for 12 months, then this health data space needs to be finished. It needs to be there. You know, what is the plan of and sequence of investment that needs to be done, and which one are urgent and which one are more long-sighted and can, you know, have a longer process. And that agility will be the huge challenge, both in the regulatory proposal, and I respect Tim says we need a bit more time, and hopefully in that time it will be much more like testing and answering and questions towards, you know, concrete cases on how to apply this, right? And that collaboration between what it needs to be done now, what is perceived, what is real problems, both in the regulatory agenda and in the investment agenda, is going on right now. And then I want to say one thing. Remember one thing, we want the Brussels effect, yes, but we also have to look at, only a few days ago, the trade strategy came out from EU. If we look at how the financial trends are going right now, EU is moving down, and China and US is staying more or less in the middle. China is like skyrocketing. And last time I looked at our trade relations, we have very strong relations also with China. So to me, this is really about, okay, we have different opinions, and this is how it's going to be, but we must have a long-term leadership towards moving the rest of the world in the same direction and really paying close attention to that process. And I know that we are doing. I'm just saying we should be very careful saying them and us in this, because I mean, there's values and then there's value, right? I mean, it needs to go hand in hand.
Thank you very much for this extremely powerful statement. Actually, I mean, you cut a little bit the grass under my feet, because you already answered the question I was going to put to Andreas. Because, I mean, in his previous intervention, he hinted at the risk that indeed the EU would be overtaken by rivals in, I mean, a kind of a competition about who is going to set the rule with regard to artificial intelligence. He identified a series of areas where the EU was lagging behind, but I mean, in a way, you further elaborated on this by also indicated what the EU should do in view of, I mean, filling the gaps and trying to catch up with its rivals. But I would nevertheless ask Andreas very briefly to comment on what he heard from you before I turn to the audience, because we are now getting the first questions. I'm very grateful for that, taking into account also that we are entering into the last dozens of minutes of this webinar. So Andreas, very briefly on Ms. Bonefeld intervention and what should be done in view of catching up if the EU has to catch up.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, and it's great to hear from our eminent speakers today. I will just try to avoid, repeating what has been said already, which is already offering quite a complete picture. But maybe just to say, what the EU needs to do abroad and what the EU needs to do at home. Maybe I will elaborate a little bit more on what the EU needs to do abroad. And so, at this point, it is currently hard to see how a global coalition would serve the interests of leading economies in AI, because there are different regulatory models and different present capacities in the US, China. And so the US had initially chosen to abstain from multilateral fora, but now this has changed. And recently the US has joined again the global partnership on AI, and that's an encouraging sign for international AI cooperation. However, a truly global partnership on AI could not work without China. And until now, Beijing's endorsement of the OECD and G20 processes had made international cooperation on AI harder, as the US was trying to deal with individual countries and like-minded countries, excluding China. However, a future Biden administration is likely to engage more meaningfully in this field. And the important question here is how to boost, again, multilateralism on global AI cooperation and internet more generally. So, while developments in the US are taking place, the EU should maintain a stable approach and foster AI regulatory alignment among its member states to encourage AI in growth in the single market. But it should also consider, very importantly, about appointing an envoy on matters of tech governance to global diplomatic dialogues. And the recent communication by the Commission and the Parliament and the Council on this was very interesting in setting the tone in how discussion between the EU and the US could take place. But you know, when we look at what should happen at home, then obviously some of the things have been mentioned already, but maybe I could just say that yes, in terms of fragmentation, we have had the GDPR a few years ago, and it was a great step that many have acknowledged. But in a way, the EU set protection and data protection rules, which are extremely important, fundamental, of course. But by setting these first and then developing, you know, a model on AI or et cetera, like the Digital Services Act, which is about platform and content governance, Digital Markets Act, which is about fair competition and digital. So, you know, by setting the GDPR first and then developing the rest, you kind of shoot yourself on the foot, because you have to already abide by strong regulations without having a framework about the implementation of these technologies and their development. So yes, it is extremely important to make sure that there is enough harmony in these things. But also, you know, we need to challenge a little bit ourselves and think beyond. So other economies, such as China, in that sense, they are able to invest heavily in providing subsidies to their companies. And maybe, you know, in this sense, the EU has a lot of catch up to do with peer economies in order to create better framework conditions for investment. Maybe in that sense, the EU should also consider whether the present external level playing field rules are beneficial to boosting growth and innovation in key areas for emerging technology, such as AI. And here, I'll just say, previous debates about the internal, external level playing field have become more relevant in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and boosting innovation for European companies will be crucial to withstand global competition. So perhaps, you know, along with everything else that has been said and about how to create better harmony between the different regulations that are coming ahead, another way to think about boosting investment would be to whether the EU should abide about these external level playing field rules that others don't apply in the same manner.
Now, for the sake of brevity, we have a few questions in the chat box. I will regroup them and address them to some of our panelists with your permission. We have a first question coming from, Chiara Cincone about, the contribution to AI to the prevention and tracking of terrorist threats and attacks. I would somewhat broaden the scope of that question and address it to you, Dragos, concerning the security-related risks, security risks related to AI, the use of AI in the security sector. Of course, there is a clear sense that, okay, of being uneasy with regard to the use of facial recognition, which is hinted at in the Commission white paper, in the outcome of the consultation, and that will certainly deal with. But there are many other areas where indeed AI could be at use in security-related matters. Let's think about border control, for instance. So maybe, Dragos, if you can take these questions in your final round of comment and intervention. There is another question concerning, guess what, the setting up of an EU agency on digitalization. And of course, it has to do with the coordination issue that we were hinting at earlier. This was, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jørgensen, somewhat hinted at in the Commission white paper. There is this idea, of course, of lighthouse centers that was also referring to, such a possible, central focal point for the development of the digitalization agenda. And I would like, Mr. Jørgensen, to hear your views about this. My guess is that when you look at the outcome of the consultation, this was not heavily supported, but you might have a different view and approach about that. There are finally two questions One about, I would say, the type of regulation that were needed, the architecture of regulation that is needed. I mean, Dragos, yourself, Mr. Jørgensen, and Ms. Bonefeld expressed views about, I mean, how this regulatory framework should be structured. The proposal from Laurens Ernalsteen here is that we could go for an horizontal legislation on ICT and then complement it by a specific legislation on AI, which is another view of how this should be structured. And again, I would leave that to either you, Mr. Jørgensen, or Dragos, or Ms. Bonefeld, because I mean, you all hinted at the kind of structure of regulation that would be needed. Last but not least, and that would be maybe a question for you again, Dragos, it's about one example of discrimination. You say that this was clearly a concern amongst the civil society organization, and it is also reflected in the outcome of the consultation, of the public consultation of the Commission, in the case of job hiring process. And of course, the participant who asked this question is referring to, okay, what if at the end of the day, we end up with ethical standards which are not exactly the one that the EU would have wished, because it was not in a position to impose its standards. So, I mean, let's take this in this follow-up order. I would start with you, Dragos, certainly concerning the security-related challenges and maybe the structure of the regulation, then move to Mr. Jørgensen, and then move to Ms. Bonefeld. Please, Dragos.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. The issue of AI and its use in security and defense is clearly a big topic. Incidentally, next week, on the 4th of March, we're going to have a dedicated joint hearing, AIDA and SEDE, the Security and Defense Subcommittee of AFET, that is going to specifically look into that. And we'll also be having in AIDA very soon a workshop on use of AI in law enforcement. So clearly, AI, like any technology, is an opportunity if used properly by law enforcement in the security area. I think the example given, or the first question related to how it is used in tracking and bringing down terrorism content, this is a very good example. And it is a well-known fact that it is through AI algorithms that actually platforms are able to very quickly detect terrorism online everywhere, where on all of the platforms where the same content has been used or multiplied or replicated. And if it hadn't been, or if we wouldn't have access, and if we wouldn't be deploying technology, or if the platforms wouldn't be deploying this technology, it would be virtually impossible to actually react on time according to the regulation standards that by now we actually have, because we do have now also a political agreement on a very important piece of legislation at EU level about terrorism content. Now, the second point here is the need to modernize law enforcement. And here there are two strengths. First of all, we need to be able to equip law enforcement with the right digital tools, including AI, to be able to do actually modern policing. I was yesterday going through the proposal of the Commission on the refreshed mandate for Europol. I'm going to be a shadow rapporteur for that as well. And I was happy to see that a good part of that proposal actually focuses on equipping Europol with the tools to help law enforcement across Europe, particularly in this area, in staying digital or growing digital, in becoming, if I can afford the metaphor, in becoming a bit of a tech police. And it is needed because, again, the world moves fast, the criminality moves fast in the online world, and therefore law enforcement needs to move as fast as criminality if it is to stay ahead and to stay competitive in fighting crime. The same goes for defense. Defense is clearly also a sector where AI and generally frontier tech is bringing benefits. But in both of these issues, in law enforcement and defense, we have to be very, very mindful, again, of the risks. Kim was talking earlier about the pyramid. I don't want to be saying myself where different applications in different sectors should be sitting on the pyramid, but I would bet you that AI applications in defense and AI applications in law enforcement, particularly when they come to the possible impact on rights of individuals, will be sitting quite high in the pyramid. And I think it's normal, particularly since we're thinking that both the law enforcement AI tools are in the hands of public authorities. And I think we have to be mindful of the Big Brother effect and also the impact that it can have on the uptake and the trust that we want. And we've all been speaking about trust. If we want our societies, our citizens to trust AI and to trust this digital transformation, this revolution that is coming upon us, then we can only achieve that trust if we show that also the state is not abusing this technology for infringing fundamental rights or for creating even the impression that somehow this technology is used to suppress rights. So therefore, again, we have to be very mindful of this tandem between the benefits that it brings in security and in fighting crime, and also in building defense capabilities, but at the same time preserving our rights and values. You were also, I don't know, since I guess we are short of time, I will also be in a way closing by addressing the other 2 points that you said. How should we regulate? I actually think that the let's say the system, the approach taken by the Commission. I'm not here to be an advocate for the Commission, but I do think that the approach taken is the right one, with the instruments on data and on management of data and the governance of data and how we handle data, both industrial, personal, public, is, and then separately an instrument on AI is the right approach. Now, of course, what is in them, that's a different discussion, and we're going to have our negotiations on that. The last question related to one example or examples of how AI can be discriminating. Well, I think there are plenty, and the job hiring or the use of AI in human resources is, I think, one of the classical examples, and probably one of the first examples that became public of how algorithms that we use to sift through CVs and make proposals for interviews or for shortlisting was actually leading to discrimination. And why was that? And I was speaking in my first intervention about data sets. Why? Because data sets that were fed through to those algorithms were intrinsically biased. They were intrinsically biased because hiring historically has been intrinsically biased. It was biased towards men versus women. It was biased whites versus non-whites, so on and so forth. Another example is the use of artificial intelligence in the penal system of several countries around the world. UK has been playing with algorithms for that in order to somewhat predict the risk of repeat offending. And those algorithms have also proved to be very discriminative along the lines of ethnicity, along the lines of social and economical background. And again, why was that the case? Because also there are intrinsic biases in existing databases. And again, that actually proves the point that when we speak of developing algorithms and the data sets that are being fed to algorithms, it is essential that we provide a security check in how those data sets are being developed, because otherwise we're simply going to replicate the discrimination, the biases of today's physical society and world into tomorrow's digital world. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Jørgensen, and then Ms. Bonefeld.
Okay, thanks. As you said, the lighthouse, I mean, didn't get so much attraction, but I think the lighthouse was more meant to be also cooperation between startups and AI professors. In the regulation that we're working on right now, there will be quite a substantial role for the market surveillance authorities in the individual member states, because they will be the one who will have to enforce the regulation. Of course, there will need to be something then at EU level. Exactly how we will do it, I think we will come back to that. I think the two questions on both the terror attacks and the discrimination shows the sort of the two ends of the AI use, and basically is what we have in all digital legislation. You have the risk sort of for discrimination, for fundamental rights, and then at the other side you have the security concern, where people will say that for example for terror attacks it would be important also to use remote biometric identification, which is going to be one of the more sensible, more sensitive issues in this horizontal legislation legal framework that the Commission is working on. Maybe just a 2 words on that. What we're working on right now for April is a horizontal legal framework that might include the following elements. It will be a framework that would follow what I said as a risk-based approach with mandatory requirements imposed for only high-risk AI systems of particular concerns. For high-risk AI systems, mandatory requirements could include use of high-quality training data which respects EU rules and values. It could be record keeping of relevant documentation regarding the data, the algorithms, and the programming and training of AI system, provision of information on AI system, performance, robustness, and accuracy requirement of human oversight. I think what is going to be important, that was also one of the questions, is that we will both have some kind of an ex-ante conformity assessment before and high-risk AI is being deployed. But then it's also very clear we cannot know everything beforehand, and therefore we also need to have this ex-post risk control. So if it's discrimination, then we can go in and sort of hunt the ones afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Ms. Bonefeld, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay, let me start by addressing the security angle. Yes, AI is a tool, and yes, it can be used for actually bringing more security in many senses. So AI can be used for nearly everything, and this is definitely one of the areas. I want to maybe highlight that it is a little bit, what can you say, if we look 50 years back, all the big innovations of technology came very much out of public sector, and not least out of often the military. If we look at right now, a lot of it is coming from private sector in these areas, and this is exactly why the collaboration between private and public sector, that being on cybersecurity, that being on the use of technologies, that being on data flows and data analyzation. I mean, right now we have a bit of trouble and hiccups after the shrimps case, and even, I mean, it will be when we have, for example, an extensive cyber attack, it will be too late to say how do we collaborate between public and private sector. How do we make sure that we basically have a discussion on vulnerabilities? How do we make sure that we have data interoperability in key areas? And how do we make sure that we have a common convention on how to use technologies and how not to use technologies, or data for that matter? So there is a big subject here that EU, NATO, and other institutions really need to discuss, how that collaboration has to be enforced and has to work of the future. So maybe taking the next one, I think on the data issue, I'm very happy to, and I really support that kind of thinking. We cannot predict everything. The high risk areas, we need to see if there are special things. We have to be super careful on the data. First of all, there is business to business. Business to business is a totally different way of interaction than business to consumer. So first of all, I have to say that. Second of all, I don't want this discussion to drown in what we don't want, but really what we want, and how do we get all the good data we have in Europe already, and for that matter, places, into play, of course, in a controlled manner. And I mean, we have, right now, there is an ongoing work also on the PSI directive on how to classify different types of data. This is definitely something that we should look at, is, you know, what does this work, and can we kind of, in that discussion, how does that link to the AI discussion? And then I would just want to tap into one more of this kind of discrimination, bias recruitment. As a woman, as a blonde woman, I can tell you that discrimination in recruitment is a fact of life still. And Europe is maybe the best place, but it's definitely a fact of life for everyone. So let's just be real. If we can actually fix that in algorithms, then it's the bloody first time in history we actually have a kind of very non-biased analysis of how, if we have equality or non-equality. So let's focus on what we can get out of it, instead of saying, AI is creating a bias that has always been there. I'm not saying that we shouldn't get rid of it, but let's focus on how we get rid of it, but not that it's creating it. So I actually think that example is a prime example of also, can we actually, are we covered? Are we covered? I mean, in Europe, you cannot discriminate. It's illegal, right? So can we actually, through algorithms, detect people who are doing it anyway, and make more enforcement? So I'm just saying, it's not really that we're not covered. So let's look at what we have first. If there is things that are not covered, okay, let's discuss it. If we're covered, let's just walk the talk. I mean, I do what we always wanted to. Then maybe the last thing, I'll do it short. Just taking me back to this one, perceived problems and real problems. I mean, if we have millions of Europeans left behind because they don't have the real skills, that's a real problem. I mean, that's a real problem. And we can talk about values, we can talk about left, right, and center, but this is a real problem. Second, and then we can invest a lot, but it's not going to be those people who are working with it anyway. So it will be a privilege of the few. Second of all, let's not go into that them and us. We have the good values. The rest of the world, do not have the right values. We have very good values that we believe in, and we should seek that common understanding also within AI as far as possible at all times. And second of all, I mean, let's be careful that we don't die in excellence, right? I mean, one thing is being really, really good, but if you cannot use it for anything or earn money with it, it's not much worth anything, right? So excellence in execution. I think Europe should be in execution mode because we're quite excellent. We have good values. We have a lot of good professors. But can we actually make things grow? Can we do it? Can we bring along the big, the people, the companies, the scale-ups? So I think we should go into much more execution mode than excellent mode. I think we're there. On excellence, we're there. Nearly there. Be better, but keep the same thing going and go into execution mode. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that, Andreas, you will agree with me that time has come to bring this conversation to a close, which is certainly a matter of frustration. I would say, let us see this meeting this morning, this virtual meeting, as an introductory one. Just the beginning of a series of maybe more in-depth and focused meetings of that kind that will have to take place in the future. I heard you loud and clear, Dragos, when you referred to, dozens, hundreds of papers, webinars, meetings of all kinds over artificial intelligence and the digital agenda. And I'm sure that you are participating in many of them. But now I think that the time has come to become more focused. I have the feeling that during our conversation this morning, we left almost no stone unturned. But we did not actually have time to dig deep into any of the issues that were raised and mentioned during the different interventions. So I think that we owe to ourselves, and ourselves mean the Brussels think tanks like EPC and Egmont now, to accompany a more focused conversation that will certainly develop in the future. For instance, Mr. Jørgensen, when the Commission will table its proposal, and you announced it for the month of April. So what I would say is I will by no means elaborate on concluding remarks. I mean, there is no time for conclusion at this point in time. We are just ahead of a very ambitious agenda which will have to be implemented, which will have to be delivered upon by all stakeholders. I mean, the private sector, the EU institutions. There was also a reference to the role that has to be played by member states. So let us now engage into that agenda. And I think that what we should do in the future, and I speak here certainly on behalf of Egmont, but I think, Andreas, that you will agree with me that I can speak on behalf of the two think tank EPC, is to get connected with you, with the Commission, with the European Parliament, with the private sector, with all stakeholders, so that we could contribute to facilitate a series of discussions that will now take place on very difficult but very crucial challenges ahead of us. The pyramid that was mentioned several times during our discussion. I mean, the assessment of the level of risk, the ex ante or ex post assessment. It suffices to read the outcome, the summary of the public consultation that was published by the Commission to immediately identify a series of very topical issues where there is indeed a broadly formulated agreement, but certainly behind this broadly formulated agreement, everybody is of the view that, okay, we have now, the time has come to enter into the regulation areas. There are so many issues and not only details. We used to say that the devil is in the details, but the devil is indeed in so many issues that were just flagged and mentioned today. So that would be our commitment, our joint-up commitment to follow up on this conversation. I really wish to thank you very warmly, Ms. Bonefeld, Mr. Tudorache, Kim Jørgensen, and you yourself, Andreas, because I mean you triggered this first joint-up webinar between EC and Egmont on artificial intelligence. Maybe sometimes in spring or after the summer, we might continue this series of meetings, not online, but offline, which means in person. Let's hope, let's keep finger crossed, but we are not there yet. I wish you all a very, very good day. I wish you all, I mean, a very successful journey to the world of artificial intelligence, because it is indeed a challenge that we cannot miss at EU level, that the EU cannot miss, that the member states cannot miss, that the industry cannot miss, and that also that the individuals and the civil society organization cannot miss. Thank you very much for your contribution to meeting these challenges. And again, thank you for all the participants, who stayed with us for a little bit more than the time that was scheduled. Thank you also to the EPC support team for having made that webinar possible. I wish you a good day and see you soon, no doubt. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Goodbye.
Bye.